So, when you hear the words colonial tea party, what's the first thing that pops into your head? It's probably Boston Harbor, right? Crates of tea getting tossed overboard, but that's not the whole story, not even close. At the very same time, another, equally powerful story of resistance was playing out down the coast in Philadelphia. And this one had a very, very different ending.
Just try to picture this scene for a second. You're in a crowded coffee house, the social hub of the city where news and reputations are made or broken. Someone reads a letter out loud, and this wave of hissing just spreads through the room. I mean, this isn't just a few people disagreeing, this is a public shaming. And the wildest part? The guys getting hissed at weren't some hated British officials. They were two of the city's own leading citizens.
And that's really the question at the heart of this whole thing. How on earth did Abel James and Henry Drinker, these prominent, well-respected Quaker merchants, end up as the villains in a citywide political drama? Their story, their personal struggle, it really pulls back the curtain on what the American Revolution felt like on the ground before a single shot was ever fired.
To really get what they were up against, we've got to rewind a bit. It all started with what looked like a simple business decision, but it spiraled into a massive crisis almost overnight. Okay, so meet our main characters, Abel James and Henry Drinker. These guys were, for all intents and purposes, the Philadelphia establishment. They were successful, they were well-known importers, and they were pillars of the Quaker community, a faith that's all about peace and nonviolence. So let's be clear, these were not natural-born rebels. They were businessmen who were deeply invested in the peace and quiet of their city.
And then, the Tea Act of 1773 lands on their desk. Now, on the surface, it kind of just looked like a corporate bailout for the East India Company, which was on the brink of collapse. The idea was to let them sell tea directly to America, making it cheaper than ever, even with that little 3-pence tax. But, and this is a big but, for the British Parliament, this was also a power play. It was their way of saying, yes, we absolutely have the right to tax you.
So from the perspective of a merchant like James or Drinker, what do you see? You see a huge opportunity. They get letters from London about getting a share of the consignments. This was a chance to become the exclusive local dealer for a global superpower of a company. You can see why, to them, this just looked like good business.
But here's the thing. What looked like a brilliant business move in a London boardroom was seen as something way, way more sinister on the streets of Philadelphia.
And this slide just nails the core of the problem. You have these two completely different realities. England sees the smart plan to save a company and sell cheap tea, maybe even put some smugglers out of business. But the colonists? They see a Trojan horse. They saw it as a violent attack on their freedom. To them, buying that cheap tea meant surrendering to the idea that Parliament could tax them whenever it wanted. It was never about the money, it was all about the principle.
And in Philadelphia, the pushback wasn't just some disorganized grumbling. Oh no. It was organized, it was fast, and it was incredibly effective.
And you just have to look at the timeline to see how fast this thing blew up. On October 16th, there's a big public meeting, and they pass these powerful resolutions. Just 2 days later, a committee is knocking on James and Drinker's door telling them to resign. And by the 22nd, less than a week later, our merchants are already in damage control mode, publishing a defense in the newspaper. The heat was on, and it was on fast.
And these resolves weren't just angry words. They were a carefully constructed argument. They laid out the core principles, that taxation without consent is theft, that this whole scheme could lead to slavery, and then they dropped the hammer. Anyone who helps this tea get to shore is an enemy to his country. They basically drew a line in the sand. You're either with us or you're against us.
Now, it's important to remember, this wasn't just a Philadelphia story. This was happening up and down the coast, and all the tea agents in the different cities were nervously writing back and forth, trying to figure out what to do.
And their private letters are so revealing. In New York, the agents are worried about smugglers, but they think the, quote, common people are very slow to catch on. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the agents are writing that the, quote, fire hath been gradually kindling, and there's now a great heat indeed in this city. So while the guys in New York are still strategizing, James and Drinker are already facing a unified, angry public.
Which brings us right back to James and Drinker, trapped between a rock and a hard place. They've got their business duties, their personal beliefs, and an entire city that's about to boil over.
You can really feel their conflict in their own words. On one hand, they're businessmen. They felt this deep sense of duty. The East India Company had entrusted them with all this valuable tea. As honest men, they felt they had to protect the property they were responsible for. It was a professional obligation.
But on the other hand, they felt like they were being totally unfairly targeted. They wrote that the committee's actions were arbitrary and seemed specifically designed to make the public hate them, to make them obnoxious. You get the sense they felt like they were being used as scapegoats in a bigger political fight.
And then, at the very core of it all, were their Quaker principles. More than anything, they wanted to avoid a fight, to break the peace of the city. So they're completely trapped. Their business sense pulls them one way, the public pressure pulls them another, and their faith is telling them to find a peaceful way out of a situation that is anything but peaceful.
So what happens? With all this pressure building, how does it all end? Well, it doesn't end with a splash in the harbor. It ends with something much, much smarter.
What Philadelphia did was, frankly, brilliant. It was a perfect four-step plan. First, they united the entire city around those powerful resolutions. Second, they used relentless social pressure to completely isolate James and Drinker. Third, when the tea ship, the Polly, finally sailed up the Delaware River, a welcome wagon went out to intercept the captain before he even got close to the city. And finally, and this is the key, they didn't threaten him. They persuaded him. They sat him down, showed him the city's resolutions, and calmly explained that he had one and only one good option: turn the ship around.
And when you compare the outcomes, Philadelphia's success is just stunning. In Boston, the tea is destroyed. In Charleston, it gets locked in a warehouse to rot. In Annapolis, it gets burned. But in Philadelphia, not 1 ounce of tea touched the shore. Not one piece of property was damaged. The ship just turned around and sailed all the way back to England. It was a complete and total victory, achieved without any violence.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. We all remember the Boston Tea Party, right? That big, violent spectacle that lit the fuse with Great Britain. But Philadelphia achieved the exact same result with zero destruction, just through sheer force of will and brilliant organization. It really makes you wonder why one story becomes a legend and the other becomes a footnote. Which tactic, at the end of the day, was truly the more powerful act of revolution?